The e-resource of this episode is Law Depot Legal Forms. Whatever your legal need, Law Depot can help. Law Depot provides customizable legal templates with step-by-step guidance. Find do-it-yourself legal documents, forms, and contracts for estate, real estate, financial, business, family. You'll find Law Depot at jocolibrary.org/research/Law Depot-legal-forms.
When it became more memoir. And in fact, I kind of did approach it very just factually, but I realized that it was a better story when it was from my perspective and my kind of editorializing or my unobjectivity really brought a different aspect to it.
Joco Library Uncovered.
Hey, Charles.
Hey, Dave.
Have you ever had too much of a good thing?
Yeah, I think I have.
Yeah.
Like too much ice cream.
Sure.
Or too much time out in the sun, get a sunburn.
Yeah, right. Yeah, absolutely. Well, we kind of ran into that issue with the podcast, didn't we?
You got sunburns?
No. We do our show here inside at the Johnson County Library, Central Resource Library, in a conference room. No sun. No, when we were recording the KC True Crime episode, we had a segment with Johnson County Library local history librarian Amanda Wallmeyer, and she was talking about all the different resources that are available for researching history here at the library.
That's true. Yeah, we had that segment, and there was all that information about research, and we also brought in an author, Jim Cosgrove,
right,
who you may know.
Mr. Stinky Feet.
Yep, Mr. Stinky Feet. He has performed at a number of our summer reading celebrations.
We did not confirm if his feet are truly stinky.
We did not. That was...
If you're tuning into this episode wondering if that question is going to be answered.
That was an oversight on our part.
Yeah, sorry about that.
But we did talk to him about his book, Ripple.
Right.
Which is about the murder of one of the sons of the McGonigle family, which is a big name around the Kansas City area.
Yeah. And that son was kind of this free spirit who had done a lot of hitchhiking and found his demise in South Carolina. And it was a cold case. However, since it didn't take place in Kansas City, though, tied to a Kansas City family, we really went back and forth. It's like, should we include this in the KC True Crime episode or not? And honestly, we just did not have enough time to put everything in that episode we wanted to.
Right. Yeah. It was a long episode as it was, so we decided to spin it out into this separate one and link it together with the interview with Amanda. And kind of tie it in under its own topic of creative nonfiction.
So creative nonfiction is really about historical storytelling. So there's a real art to it. You've got the facts that you've researched thoroughly, but then you need the language that brings it all to life. And so you're talking about language that provides the context, the setting, the scene, and really brings a good story to life. And, it makes for what is good storytelling. And so we will get into that interview with Jim Cosgrove and the wonderful resources with Amanda. But first, some news.
Library news.
So this is from Jim Cosgrove's book, Ripple, A Long, Strange Search for a Killer. Our story is no different from what a lot of families have dealt with. A child, a brother, whoever. They got murdered in a violent way that didn't make any sense. Really, it's just another story of a hideous, violent crime perpetrated by a stupid with a handgun that should have never been on the street to begin with. Of course, you didn't say that, though.
I did not say that.
Yeah, you were reporting that from one of the people in your books.
Yes, that was, and I'm glad you picked that because that is really kind of wraps up this story in a nutshell. And it was a quote by Mike McGonigle the brother of Frank McGonigle, who disappeared from Kansas City in 1982 and was murdered.
Yeah. And it's a fascinating book. Once again, that's called Ripple, and that is here in our collection. Before we get too far into this, we should introduce Jim. And I should mention that we also have local history librarian, Amanda Wallmeyer.
Yes.
And of course, this guy everybody knows and loves.
Charles.
Charles.
I'm back.
So, I'm not sure where you got this from, Charles, but it says that Cosgrove is a nationally recognized award-winning children's entertainer known by young fans as Mr. Stinky Feet. He is also the author of 3 children's books and Everybody Gets Stinky Feet, a collection of inspirational essays from his time as a parenting columnist for the Kansas City Star. So this is what I find just really fascinating, Jim. You say in your book that you're not really a fan of true crime and you tend to gravitate to happier things.
Yes.
So why write a book that is described on the cover as a riveting true crime storytelling, chilling and unforgettable?
Yes. Well, this story, I came on this story 7 or 8 years ago, and I approached it really as a look at family and what a family goes through with tragedy. That was my focus. I grew up in a big Irish Catholic family. The McGonigles are a big Irish Catholic family whom I knew growing up, and I was fascinated by family dynamics and by birth order and how families deal with this. So I went into it with that angle, really not thinking of it as a true crime story.
Right.
Well, as it unfolded, it became a true crime story. And I also intended not to be part of the story. Yeah. I was trained as a journalist to stay out of the story.
Well, let me jump in there because so much of the book is about the telling of the story.
Yes.
And so you were a newspaper reporter for a time. And so you feel like those skills helped you in the telling of the story?
Oh, yes, absolutely. Yeah. I did at the beginning, I did my best to be the reporter and stay out of the story. And my skills as an investigator and researcher certainly helped dig deeper. And as it became, as it unfolded as really a true crime story, I went with it. And I consider it as much a memoir as a true crime piece.
Yeah. Yeah. Was it difficult to kind of step back and have the kind of objectivity that you would want when you have such a connection to that family?
That was difficult, and that's when it became more memoir. And in fact, I kind of did approach it very just factually, but I realized that it was a better story when it was from my perspective and my kind of editorializing or my unobjectivity really brought a different aspect to it. So
and I find it to be a really challenging story to tell. One, it's a cold case. It's still a cold case.
Correct.
For this genre, I feel like the climax for those books usually are the murder. Or the solving of the murder.
Right.
You don't have that. And so do you feel like, part 3 of your book, that's really the resolution of, kind of focusing on the family and having them come to accept it and piece together what might have happened?
Yes. So some of the feedback I've gotten from some real true crime fans has been, hey, well, where's the Hollywood ending? Where's where's the frontier justice? Where is, who's going to pay for this kind of a thing? And really, for me, I think it's more powerful where I ended. And I think I ended in a place that kind of surprised me a little bit or was different from where it would have ended had I finished writing the story when I started. So I started in 1995 as my master's thesis. I submitted it as my thesis and graduated and all that.
Okay.
But it was never published, and I didn't really wrap up the story completely until the pandemic, when I had time to write. And so I was married. I have 2 children since then. My life has changed, and I think I approached it differently. And I ended in a place of compassion. Heavy compassion, not only for clearly the McGonigle family, but also for the alleged perpetrators too.
Yeah.
Would I have been any different had I grown up in where they grew up and how they grew up? Yeah. So, and that kind of surprised me, but I was very pleased with how that felt as a writer. That's what this story needed.
And it's that family element. It goes back to that quotation in the beginning that we had from your book. It's about these senseless crime stories. I mean, senseless stories about senseless crimes and unnecessary violence. And I think that's the part. I think people get excited. They hear, oh, Casey. True crime, and they're listening to this episode. But we will emphasize in this that these are real people. These are families.
Yes.
We
Thank you.
Sometimes forget about, the victims and the struggle. And
I start every presentation I make about this book with that point. So I do a lot of book clubs and presentations at libraries and civic places. And I start with that very thing. This, just remind everybody, this is a story about Frank McGonigle, who was a son, a brother, an uncle, a friend. And when we read nonfiction, sometimes we forget that, wait, these are not fictional characters. These are real people and real families involved. Yes.
So, Jim, then researching this and talking about people and connections, did you learn anything more about Kansas City and the history of crime in Kansas City at all? And maybe this would be a good time to bring in Amanda, since you're our local history librarian. What kinds of connections did you make to your own life or your family or the people you grew up around?
Yes, I started in Brookside, Casey Mo Brookside, which is where I grew up. And I went with what I knew, but certainly as a reporter, I dug in deeper about what are the origins of Brookside, which brought me to J.C. Nichols, which brought me to redlining, which brought me to all kinds of Kansas City history that really does kind of tie in, for me anyway, with how I was brought up and why I was brought up, why. I didn't realize that there were places where neighborhoods weren't just Catholic and Jewish. I mean, that was it. Those are the only people I knew growing up were Catholic and Jewish people, because that's all who lived in our neighborhood.
Sure.
And as a kid, then you grow, expand. But where did all the Protestants go? Well, they all went to Johnson County, and why? And so, that was fascinating for me.
Yeah.
So, Amanda, do you read or listen to or watch true crime?
I do. I am a murderer now. Okay. If you listen to My Favorite Murder, you will understand that reference.
Yes.
I think Jim brings up a good point that history puts our modern experience into context of why things are the way they are. Speaking of the redlining thing, I'll put in a brief plug for our Dividing Lines tour that you can find online to kind of explore that a little further. Back to true crime, the need to know all of this information, I think, comes from a very primal place in us to stay safe, to care about others, builds empathy. And you can do this all by exploring your local history.
Yeah, for sure.
Very cool.
And I will put it, there's a lot of fascinating local history tied to true crime, and which is what you guys do.
Yeah.
And since I've written this, I have received emails from people wanting to tell, hey, I've got a story. Or
And I find it fascinating. So yours is a true story. The blurring of what's real and what is not of Kansas City true crime really fascinates me, because I've started to see so many mentions of Kansas City crime in the shows that I watch. I'm thinking of I don't know if you're familiar with the television show Fargo, but season 4 was based in Kansas City. So at the beginning of every show, there's a little disclaimer. That's not really a disclaimer. It says, "This is a true story. At the request of the survivors, the names have been changed. Out of respect for the dead, the rest has been told exactly as it occurred." Not true. Not true at all. I was so disappointed after I researched that. Huh. Yeah.
Oh, wow.
But after, reading directly from the Coen brothers, that's part of the mystique of it. They want it to seem like it's true. And I didn't doubt it for a second.
And I will say that, and Amanda, you may corroborate this, but in the telling of local lore, fable starts to kind of weave its way in just with the passage of time and the retelling of it. And I found that out not only, the story takes place part in Kansas City and part in South Carolina.
Right.
Same thing going on in the South Carolina part. As people told stories, things got a little foggy and people had different approaches. So that's how.
And it's all personal memory. Changes so much over the years.
Right.
And then the lore that comes in with things like that, like for Kansas City, for example, Pendergast was in charge for how many years, and all the mafia ties and everything has built up into this legend in Kansas City that maybe 40% of it is true.
Right.
Right. And but so much of it is so compelling. When you talk about, was it the Savella family?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Yeah. And how they were, followed for so many years and surveilled. And ultimately, when there was a betting issue with Super Bowl IV, a wiretap catching, the crime. It's so fascinating that became referenced a number of times in different movies, about the mafia and maybe even the Godfather movies. I'm not sure about that.
They do mention in one of the Godfather movies. They do mention Kansas City. It's just one of their outposts.
Yeah.
Yes.
There you go.
Yes, and speaking of Kansas City Mafia, I need to put a plug in for my buddy Terrence O'Malley, who is a local author and filmmaker who has done a deep dive on local mafia. He's done a Black Hand Straw Man is one about the Kansas City Mafia. He's done another one about the relationship between Tom Pendergast and Harry Truman. And he's done a story that has a personal tie for him called Nellie Don, A Stitch in Time, which is a story about the kidnapping of Nell Donnelly, who was at one time the owner of the largest female-owned business in the United States.
Wow.
During really in the 20s and 30s and 40s and 50s really went on. Yeah, fascinating stories.
Wow. So, Amanda, do you have any good resources for people if they're looking through the collection that, off the top of your head, that you can think of that people might check out if they're looking for other reading or materials to look at true crime? Yeah,
so clearly in our nonfiction section, we have a very wide array of true crime articles. If you're wanting to look into, kind of do your own research on your own local true crime story, we have a lot of resources that were not available like in the 90s when you were doing your research.
Yes.
So we have local newspapers on microfilm, which would have been available in the 90s.
But yes, they were available on microfilm and microfiche, and I had to go and now I can do it online. It's so much easier.
That's exactly where I was going with that. So the Kansas City Star back to 2013, you can find digitized online through the portal where you find the daily Kansas City Star on our website. And then
e-library,
yes, in the e-newspapers. Yes, thank you. And we're in the process of digitizing all of the microfilm for our local papers, including the Johnson County Sun and the Johnson County Herald, which were the two like major newspapers for all of Johnson County. In addition to that, we have maps and directories if you're looking for like where businesses were, trying to get a feel for what the neighborhood looked like or where people lived. You can do reverse searches on just the house number, or you can look up by name if you know the name.
How about photos?
We have lots of photos online. JocoHistory.org is our partnership with the Johnson County Museum and several other organizations in the county. And they have pictures from all of the prominent families, I think, in Johnson County, plus some. And then we also have several of the Shawnee Mission School District yearbooks digitized. So if you're looking for yearbooks photos of family members or maybe true crime related people, you can find those there. You can also find some famous people. We like to call it the Ted Lasso effect. Mm-hmm. We've seen a big jump in searches for Jason Sudeikis on Joco History.
Right.
But those kind of resources would not have been available pre-digital era unless you made an appointment and had time to dig through archives and boxes. And I really enjoyed when you talked about your research being in the moldy boxes in your basement, because that's where indeed. A lot of research is.
Right. And I will say I used the high school yearbook. There's a national one as well. It's spotty, but to try to locate some photos of these those were alleged to have perpetrated the crime against Frank. But one guy I could not find. The only thing I could find was a third grade photo of this guy.
Oh my gosh!
And then after that, he kind of disappeared. He didn't show up for picture day, or I don't change schools. I don't know. But I mean, I looked in all the surrounding areas. But anyway, it's. Right. I love that part of research, by the way.
Yeah, it makes it so much easier to have that online resource.
Yes. Yeah.
But if it's not online, we do have interlibrary loan, where you can request newspapers from South Carolina on microfilm, and they can come to the Central Branch, and you can look at the microfilm right here at home.
And you mentioned South Carolina because that's where much of your book takes place, because that's where Frank ended up. So in addition to all those resources for people that want to research for perhaps writing or just studying true crime, we have a number of items in our collection. We'll try to make sure to include those in our show notes and make a playlist, but those include
jocolibrary.org/uncovered for that list.
Yes, and that includes not only nonfiction, but fiction and some movies and television shows. And of course, that includes Jim's book, Ripple. And just a few final questions for you. How long did that process take you again to write that book?
Well, like I said, I finished my thesis in 95. It sat in a box for about 20 years. Yeah. And then after the retelling of the story, I told this story hundreds of times, and my nieces really encouraged me. They got into true crime when they were, in teens in their early 20s, and they said, "You got to do this story." And they listened to podcasts. This is perfect for a podcast. And so I brought those files up from the basement, dusted them off literally, and dove in. And so it was published 26 years after I started the research. Wow. So persistence. And I will remind those of you who like to write, it's never too late.
Don't go anywhere. There's more Joco Library Uncovered to come.
So there's so many resources out there for writers wanting to pursue creative nonfiction, and we turn to a really great website called Find Your Creative Muse. And we'll have the link to that in our show notes. The subtitle is Learn How to Write Poetry, Fiction, Personal Essays, and More. And the blog post that I'm going to quote a few things from is entitled Creative Nonfiction, Writing About History. He writes, "A historical text presents the facts and causes and effects and significance. Creative nonfiction does the same, but also adds narrative, including storytelling, dialogue, setting, character development. Writing nonfiction history relies on an authoritative tone and is written in the third person." Yeah, so, I feel like what we heard from Mr. Cosgrove today very much fits that. Would you not agree?
I would, yeah. And having read through the book myself, I would agree that that is definitely a good example of creative nonfiction. It's told, all the backstory facts are there, but it's more fleshed out. You get more sense of character and more sense of that setting and that South Carolina. I've never been there, but it feels like I could describe like what was the sensation of being out there on the dock or in the woods.
Yeah. Mr. Hood continues. He says the 5 R's of creative nonfiction, writing about history as a creative nonfiction writer, involves real life, so writing about real people, actual events, and actual places; research, collecting facts from the library, interviews, internet; writing, which does not start with an R. I don't know if you can trust this guy. Writing literary journalism essays, autobiographies, and biographies; reflection, sharing personal thoughts, feelings, perspectives; and then reading. Read autobiographies, biographies, and other informative books about history. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So I thought that was all really an interesting way to present Mr. Cosgrove's story with this idea that it is a really good example of creative nonfiction.
Joco Library Uncovered.
Well, if you enjoyed today's topics, you might just be interested in these recommendations from our collection. First, Charles' choices.
And today I'm recommending Dodge City, Wyatt Earp, Bat Masterson, and the Wickedest Town in the American West by Tom Clavin, Clavin. You'll see it in the show notes. This one is a good example of kind of what we were talking about, where he sets up all the facts, but he goes into the storytelling and tells all of these fascinating about all these characters that were just coming through Dodge City all at the same time. Yeah. And they went on to be these huge names in the mythology of the American West. So he digs into the facts around those individuals. The other book I'm recommending is The Devil in the White City by Eric Larson, which is, if you're interested in kind of like the crime side of things and the creative nonfiction, this is right up your alley. It is about a serial killer, H.H. Holmes, and I think he's considered one of America's first serial killer. And the story that they tell around the Chicago World's Fair and his activities and the murders that he's committing, it's all woven together in this narrative that I really enjoyed.
Excellent. Well, next we have a Dave's double feature. Why not Capote, which is a biographical drama about the author Truman Capote and his writing of the nonfiction novel In Cold Blood. I don't know if you knew this, but that took place, that murder happened in 1959. It was the murders of 4 members of the Clutter family in a small farming community in Holcomb, Kansas. My mom grew up in Winfield, Kansas, and she said it was just shocking that kind of crime happened so close in such a small, peaceful community. Yeah. And so anyways, I think this is a great example of creative nonfiction because Capote did a wonderful job really capturing all those details, investigating this murder. But the movie is also about Capote the man and, his struggles with putting together this investigation, and really it was kind of a new kind of book. And so, very interesting movie. It stars Philip Seymour Hoffman, so you can never go wrong with that. And
That's true.
Unfortunately, there's only a limited body of his work since he passed. Anyways, you can find that on Canopy. It's in the streaming video section of our e-library. That's jocolibrary.org/e-library. And we have All the President's Men both on DVD and the book by Carl Bernstein. And the movie has Dustin Hoffman and Robert Redford as they star in the true story of how Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein uncovered the White House involvement in the Watergate break-in. And it's pretty fantastic if you've never seen it. And then we'll go ahead and mention from our guest, Jim Cosgrove. In our catalog, you'll find the title that we discussed today, Ripple. It's in print, ebook, and downloadable audiobook formats. But you'll also see 12 other titles by Jim that have nothing to do with murder whatsoever.
No.
Yeah.
Yeah, you'll see music and books for kids, and just goes to show the diversity of talent that he is.
Yeah. And for a full list of book report recommendations, you can find those on our webpage, jocolibrary.org/uncovered.
Joco Library Uncovered is a production of Johnson County Library and is recorded at the Central Resource Library in Overland Park, Kansas. We would love to read your thoughtful emails at uncovered@jocolibrary.org. Join our online conversation at facebook.com/JocoLibrary. Look for us on Twitter at Joco Library. Our website is jocolibrary.org. Subscribe to Joco Library Uncovered through your favorite podcatcher or go to jocolibrary.podbean.com. Thanks for listening, and come back in 2 weeks for more Joco Library Uncovered.